The desert wind carried her voice cracked, desperate, and trembling. "Please, I beg you, untie it." The rancher froze, his hand still gripping the rope that bound her fate. All his life, tradition ruled him no mercy for Apaches. But in that moment, beneath the burning sun and the eyes of his own men, something shifted. He saw not an enemy, but a girl fighting for her life. And when he reached for his knife, he knew this single act would brand him a traitor forever. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you never miss a ride into the Old West. The desert stretched endless and merciless beneath the noon sun, each gust of wind carrying the sting of sand across the parched earth. Heat shimmered off the ground like a living thing, coiling around a lonely figure kneeling in the dust, an Apache girl, no more than 17, wrists bound with coarse hemp rope that cut into her skin every time she breathed. Beside her, a thin and exhausted paint horse from her tribe stood tethered to a post, its ribs visible, its head lowered in surrender. The air reeked of sweat, leather, and something heavier, judgment. Around her, 6 men stood in a loose half-circle, all ranch hands of the Cutter brand, their faces half hidden under wide-brimmed hats, eyes narrowed not in pity but suspicion. Behind them, the flat expanse of Elias Cutter's land spread to the horizon, miles of fenced range, hard-won from dust, drought, and blood. Elias himself stood at the center of it all, hat pulled low against the glare, one gloved hand resting on the rope coiled at his hip. He was a man carved from the same sun-baked grit that ruled this land mid-40s, his face worn deep with lines of labor and loss, his shirt clinging to his back with sweat. Yet despite his stoic stance, there was hesitation in his eyes, the faint flicker of a memory trying to break through the armor of habit. One of his men spat into the dirt and broke the silence. "Caught her at the South Creek," he muttered, jerking his chin toward the girl. "Tracks led right to our herd. Horse was dragging a calf hide. You know what that means, Elias." Another added, "Thievin' Apache. They'll cut your throat same night you show 'em mercy." The words hung heavy, and Elias said nothing. He looked down at the girl, whose breathing came shallow and uneven. Her dark eyes met his, not pleading, not yet, only waiting. The desert wind lifted her hair across her face, and a strand caught on her cracked lips as she whispered, almost too faint to hear, "Please, I beg you, untie it." The words struck him like the crack of a whip, not for their sound but for what they carried, something raw, human, and painfully familiar. For a moment he wasn't standing in his own yard but back 20 years, watching another woman kneel in dust, the world burning behind her, begging for mercy that never came. His jaw tightened, the phantom echo of his father's voice roaring through his head. "Mercy to an Apache is a betrayal to your own." Elias forced his gaze away, looking toward the horizon where the sky wavered molten gold. The girl's horse snorted, pawing at the dirt, and the movement drew his eyes back. Her wrists had bled against the rope, small trails of red ran down to her fingertips. She was young, maybe his daughter's age if he'd ever had one. "What's your name?" he asked finally, voice rough. She didn't answer, only swallowed hard, her shoulders trembling as the wind tore at her dress. One of the men scoffed. "She don't speak much English, ain't worth talking to." But Elias heard her whisper again, soft and broken, "Untie it." Her gaze flicked toward the post, not toward her wrists, as though it wasn't herself she begged for, but the horse beside her, its legs shaking from thirst. Elias froze, something twisting in his chest. That kind of mercy to beg not for your own life but another's was not the mark of a thief. And though the heat beat down harder, a chill crept up his spine, whispering that this moment, beneath the burning sun, would not leave him unchanged. The girl's whisper still echoed in Elias Cutter's ears as he stood unmoving, staring down at her bound hands trembling against the coarse hemp rope, her skin raw where it had torn against the fibers. The world around him was a shimmering haze of heat and dust, but inside his chest the air turned cold, a hollow ache he hadn't felt in years. His father's voice came back sharp as a branding iron, cutting through time. "Mercy to an Apache is betrayal to your own." Those words had been spoken beneath this same unrelenting sun, in the same scorched air, long before this girl was even born. They were the first lesson Elias ever learned as a boy, the law of blood, of survival, of the white man's claim to this cracked earth. His father had drilled it into him with every lash of a rein, every cattle lost, every scar left behind by raids and fire. Mercy is weakness, his father had said, his voice low over a dying campfire. And weakness gets men killed. For most of his life, Elias had believed that to the bone. It had built his reputation, his ranch, and the walls inside him that nothing, not even the memory of love, could tear down. Yet now, as he watched this young Apache girl kneeling beneath the same punishing sun that once burned over his father's grave, something began to crack inside him. Her voice, small, desperate, stirred memories buried deep, memories of that night 10 years ago when the horizon had burned red and the sky screamed with gunfire. He could still smell it: smoke, blood, and horse sweat. The raids had come without warning, the Apache striking from the dark like shadows born from vengeance. His wife, Mara, had been caught outside the cabin, trying to untie the horses before they could be stolen. Elias had found her at dawn, her face cold and still, a crimson streak across her neck where mercy had failed her. That sight had hollowed him, turned his grief into a weapon. From that day, every Apache became the same face in his eyes, every one of them an echo of the blade that took her life. He had fed on that hate, used it to build fences, to drive cattle, to survive in a land that would sooner kill you than forgive you. But hate was a poor companion, and over the years it had eaten away more than the enemy ever could. Looking now at the girl's trembling hands, the sun glinting off the turquoise beads at her throat, Elias felt a strange dissonance, the memory of Mara's kindness, her voice whispering to a stray colt, her laughter soft as rain on tin, rising against the iron creed of his father's words. Could this girl who barely met his eyes, who flinched each time a man's boots scraped the ground, truly carry the guilt of what happened that night? Or had he just been clinging to his pain so long that he no longer knew where justice ended and vengeance began? His throat tightened. He wanted to walk away, to let the code speak for him, but his boots stayed planted in the dust. The men behind him shifted, growing impatient under the heat, waiting for his order. One of them muttered, "She's just another one, boss. You know what your pa would have done." And that was the curse of it, he did know. He'd seen his father string men up, burn what they'd touched, call it righteous. But now, with the ghost of his wife and the heat of the sun pressing down on his back, Elias felt something different, stirring not forgiveness, not yet, but the unbearable weight of realizing that the code he'd lived by might have been built not on honor, but on fear. Boots shuffled and dust rose in thin sheets as ranch hands rearranged themselves around the bound figure, their low voices folding into a grit-heavy litany. Hand her to the sheriff and let law unravel this thread. Drag her behind the barn and string her where everyone could see, or make the trouble end quietly where no judge need be called. Elias Cutter felt those murmurs press in like weather, an old pattern of expectation that had shaped every decision he'd ever made. This was how the world around him demanded order, how names were kept clean and fences stayed whole. The men's faces were set and sun-browned, jaws working as they spat into the dust, one or two fingers ghosting the triggers of rifles slung across their shoulders, as if to remind the rest of the room how easily a problem could be solved. Somewhere in the chorus there were voices he'd trust with his life, and voices that only echoed his father's iron rules, but none of them spoke with the tiny, unnatural hesitation that tightened his own throat. He could feel the code like a harness across his chest, duty, pride, vengeance folded into one seamless thing he had carried since the day his wife died, and he learned to turn grief into a blade. Yet the longer he looked at the girl, the less the chorus mattered. The soft scrape of her breath became the loudest sound in the yard, a fragile metronome that measured out a different kind of calculus. Her wrists were raw where rope had dug into skin. Small tracks of red darkened the coarse hemp. Turquoise beads at her throat flashed once in a shaft of light, a bright, tender thing at odds with the hard geometry of men and fences and law. When she lifted her face, the lines in it read not like the map of a criminal but like a ledger of loss, hollowed eyes, cheeks, sun-scored, a mouth that had learned silence because the world around it had been too quick to answer words with iron. Elias felt memory rise, not as a clean photograph but as an ache. Mara's laugh under a tin roof, hands that knew how to soothe a frightened colt, a voice that had once argued that pity was not weakness, but a thing that kept men human. The image bucked against the taller, older image of his father on a porch, voice low and final. Mercy to an Apache is betrayal to your own. That voice had rung like a law in him, and it had built him as stone builds a wall, deliberate, resistant, exclusionary. It had protected his cattle, his name, the stretch of flagged earth that made up Cutter Ranch. It had also seared blind spots into him. Now both faces lived in the same room, weighing him. Around him, impatience grew thin and sharp. Someone swore under his breath. Another spat. Someone's boot hit the post with a dull sound, like a judge's gavel. "Boss?" a man said, trying for the old command in his tone. Elias's hand brushed the rope at his hip, feeling the familiar grain of hemp under leather. His other hand itched toward the knife at his belt, an old habit ready to finish what words had begun. Instead, he felt his chest unclench a fraction, and the air that had been all heat and threat thinned into something almost like possibility. The girl's whisper came again, barely more than a breath this time. "Untie it." It was not only for her wrists, he realized. It was for the horse tethered beside her, ribs faint under dull coat, eyes heavy with thirst. The recognition hit him like cool water. Unexpected and clear, this plea was not a ploy for freedom but a small, desperate plea to spare another life. For the first time since the fire that had taken Mara, Elias saw the brittle geometry of his creed for what it often had been. A fence built to keep out fear, not to hold injustice. The men around him shifted, ready to act. The desert held its breath. The day waited on the hinge of his next move. Elias Cutter's voice cracked through the still air like the crack of a whip, sharp and dry from disuse. "Why were you on my land?" The question hung there, rough as gravel, echoing off the empty corral and the stony silence of the men who stood watching. The Apache girl lifted her head just enough for her eyes to meet his, not defiant this time, but searching, as though trying to read what kind of man stood before her. The sun had baked the color from everything, and her lips were split, but she found her words, halting, uneven, English strained by accent and fear. "Brother." "Taken," she said, the syllables breaking, her breath shaking with effort. "He not bad man. They say, murder. Not true." The words staggered out, fragile and desperate, the sound of someone who had been forced to trade silence for survival. She paused, swallowing hard, then added, "I come for food. Water. I bring horse. Trade. Sheriff say mercy for trade." Her gaze flickered toward the small horse tethered beside her, and her throat tightened as though the effort of speaking had drawn blood. Elias felt something pull in his chest, something sharp and familiar, the sound of a plea he had once made himself in another lifetime. The men shifted uneasily, scoffing under their breath. "She's lyin', boss," one muttered. "Always got a story, these folks. They'll tell you the moon's gold if you let 'em." But Elias barely heard them. His mind was somewhere else, far from this yard, in a place buried deep beneath the years and dust, the winter of his 20th year, when his herd had been dying from blight, and his father had been too proud to ask for help. Elias had ridden 3 days through sleet to the army post at Fort Sumner, hat in hand, begging for grain to keep the cattle alive. He could still feel the sting of that memory, the officer's sneer, the laughter that followed his request, the way he had been turned away like a beggar, humiliated before men who never knew his name. He had returned to his father's ranch hollow and furious, vowing never again to plead, never again to let mercy make a fool of him. Yet here stood this girl, bound in rope and thirst, daring to ask for that same mercy he had long buried in himself. He studied her as the dry wind lifted dust around them, and for the first time since she had been caught, he saw something besides guilt in her face, a quiet, worn kind of dignity that comes only from love. Her brother was all she had left. That much was plain. And the horse, half wild, small-boned, its coat scarred with the marks of long travel, was proof she had meant what she said. A trade, a plea, a hope. Elias's eyes burned against the glare of the sun, though he couldn't tell whether it was sweat or memory stinging them. He had been told all his life that mercy was weakness, that to bend was to lose, yet here was a girl who had walked straight into the lion's mouth for someone she loved. Her courage was not weakness, it was the raw, blistered edge of strength. He felt the old walls inside him tremble. The memory of his father's words pressed down like iron, but so did the sound of Mara's laughter, her gentle hand on his shoulder years ago. Whispering that compassion never took from a man, it returned to him what the world tried to strip away. Around him, The men's murmurs dimmed, their impatience mixing with curiosity. Elias's jaw tightened. He took one step closer, his shadow falling across the girl's face. "Who's your brother?" he asked. She looked up, eyes glinting dark with both hope and terror. "Taza," she said softly. "They say he kill rancher. He no kill. He protect." The name struck something deep, the faint, painful knowledge that every man, no matter his color or creed, was someone's brother, someone's son. And for the first time in many years, Elias Cutter didn't know whether he was standing as a rancher, a judge, or the ghost of a man who'd once needed mercy himself. The blade came down in one clean motion, a swift, deliberate strike that sliced through more than the rope it carved through years of silence, through a legacy built on hate and fear, through the very marrow of Elias Cutter's soul. The sound was small, barely a whisper, yet it cracked through the yard like thunder. The rope split, frayed ends snapping apart as a puff of dust rose between them, curling into the wind like smoke from a dying fire. For a breathless second, no one moved. The Apache girl stared at her hands as if they were no longer hers, her wrists red and ridged from the coarse fiber, the broken strand still trembling from the force of the cut. The knife slipped slightly in Elias's grasp, its edge dulled by sweat and sun, and the weight of what he had just done settled into his bones like a slow, cold ache. Behind him, gasps broke the stillness. "Jesus, Elias," one of the men hissed. "What the hell have you done?" Another spat into the dirt, boots scuffing as they took a half-step back, as though the act itself had summoned something unholy. Even the horses stirred, uneasy, their tails flicking, eyes wide and rolling white. Dust swirled between them, drawn up in slow circles by the desert wind, wrapping around Elias and the girl like ghostly smoke, and in that shimmering veil, it was as though the old world, the one built on blood oaths and unbending rules, was burning away. Elias stood still, breathing hard, the knife hanging limp at his side, his pulse echoing in his ears like the rhythm of war drums. The girl didn't move. Her eyes darted between the men, her chest heaving as if she expected a bullet at any moment. Her lips parted but silent. Then, finally, her hands fell into her lap, free and trembling, her fingers curling as if testing the air, the reality of release too fragile to trust. A hush fell over the yard, that strange, electric stillness that comes before a storm. Elias's men looked from him to the girl and back again, each waiting for him to say something, to take it back somehow, to make it right in the language they understood: violence, punishment, order. But there was no taking it back. The sun glared white overhead, baking every sound, every color, until even the shadows seemed to hide from what had just happened. Elias looked down at the severed rope coiled at his boots and thought of his father. Thought of the way the old man had talked about honor as if it were something you had to defend with a blade, not something you could preserve with mercy. You break the code, boy. You break yourself. That's what the old man had said. Maybe it was true. But for the first time, Elias wasn't afraid of breaking. He was afraid of staying whole in a world that had turned its back on decency. He turned toward the girl, meeting her gaze again, and in her eyes, he saw no hatred, no triumph, only disbelief and something close to sorrow, as if she, too, understood the weight of what had been done. The wind rose suddenly, whipping the dust into a spiral that stung his face and caught her hair, lifting it like a black banner in the Sunday. It felt biblical, that moment not as a miracle but as a reckoning, the desert itself bearing witness to a curse undone. Elias sheathed the knife, the metal sliding home with a sound that felt final, and when he spoke, his voice came out low but steady, stripped of pride, stripped of everything except truth. "It's done," he said. "Ain't no going back." The words hung between them, a new law in a land that had only ever known the old one. The sound of the knife tearing through the rope was soft, almost fragile, like paper splitting in the wind. Yet it carried through the yard with a weight that seemed to echo off every fence post and iron nail for miles around. Elias Cutter didn't breathe for a moment afterward. He simply stood there, his chest heaving beneath the sweat-soaked fabric of his shirt, the severed rope hanging limp from his fist. The Apache girl flinched at first, as though expecting the blow that would surely follow. But when it didn't come, her arms fell forward, her wrists trembling with the uncertain gravity of freedom. The coarse fibers that had bitten into her skin for hours now dropped into the dust between them. coiling like the shed skin of something venomous left behind. Elias could feel the stares of his men digging into his back, disbelief, anger, disgust, each a knife of its own. One of them cursed under his breath. Another spat and turned away, and a third muttered, "He's lost his damn mind." The old code had been broken, right there in the open, under the same sun that had witnessed every hanging, every branding, every sin of survival this land demanded. The wind picked up just then, sweeping through the yard in a sudden gust that kicked up dust like a living spirit. It coiled between Elias and the girl, swirling around them both until the air shimmered and burned. For a heartbeat, the entire world seemed to pause, no sound but the whistle of that wind and the soft clatter of loose tack on the horses tethered nearby. It felt holy in some strange, unspeakable way, not as a gift from heaven but as a reckoning, the desert itself watching, bearing silent witness to something older than law, older than vengeance. The girl looked up at him, eyes wide and wild, and for the first time since the men had dragged her here, her lips parted not in fear but in disbelief. She touched her wrists, feeling the tender ridges the rope had left, then looked down at the broken strands at her feet as if the whole thing were a cruel trick. Her voice, when it came, was a whisper that trembled like wind through dry grass. Why? It was a question Elias didn't have an answer, for not yet, maybe not ever. He only knew that the knife in his hand had felt heavier the longer he'd held it, that the weight of generations of hate had finally become too much to bear. He thought of his father then, the old man's ghost hovering just beyond sight, eyes blazing with disapproval. And he wondered if breaking that sacred rule meant breaking himself for good. Maybe it did. But looking at the girl, he knew he couldn't have done anything else. The men's voices rose behind him now, angry and fearful. "You're making a mistake, Elias," one growled. "Ain't no forgiving that kind." Another spat again, his voice trembling with the fury of the powerless. "You're as good as one of them now." Elias turned slowly, his jaw set, the knife still glinting at his side. "Maybe that's so," he said quietly, his voice carrying just enough to be heard over the wind. "But maybe that's what needed doing a long time ago." The words felt final, like an oath made not to the men, nor to the land, but to whatever God still watched this forsaken stretch of desert. Behind him, the girl took a hesitant step forward, her movements uncertain, her shadow merging with his on the sun-baked ground. The dust between them began to settle, the storm dying back into stillness. The broken rope lay half buried in the sand, a relic already being swallowed by time, and Elias knew, as he stared down at it, that something in him had been cut loose as well. Something that would never again fit back into the man he'd been when the day began. For a long, taut heartbeat, no one moved, the silence in the ranch yard as heavy as a thundercloud ready to break. Then a single wet spit hit the dust at Elias Cutter's boots. "You've gone soft, Cutter," the ranch hand said, voice rough with disgust, his eyes narrowing beneath the brim of his hat. Another man shifted beside him, his knuckles tightening around the stock of his rifle, the faint click of metal loud enough to carry. "Ain't right, Elias," he muttered. "Ain't what your old man would have done. You're turning your back on your own." Elias turned toward them slowly, his face a mask of calm carved from years of hard living, though his heart thundered like hooves against the inside of his ribs. The Apache girl stood behind him now, unbound but motionless, as if she feared even the act of breathing might set the men off. The desert wind cut through the yard again, carrying with it the smell of dry sage and sweat, and for a moment the world felt smaller than it ever had before, just sun, dust, and the weight of what had been broken. "You don't like it," Elias said at last, his voice low, steady as the edge of a blade. "Ride out." The words were simple, but they hit like a hammer. A few of the men froze, uncertain if they'd heard him right, while others exchanged glances, searching for the courage to defy the man they'd followed for years. These were men who'd ridden through drought and stampede under his orders, men who had bled for this ranch, who had believed Cutter blood meant something sacred. To them, what Elias had just done wasn't mercy, it was betrayal. "Ride out?" One scoffed, stepping forward. "Hell, this ranch was built on our backs. You think we'll just walk 'cause you lost your damn mind over some redskin girl?" Elias's gaze found him, cold and sharp as winter steel. "Then you'd best start walking faster," he said. The hand's mouth twisted. But something in Elias's eyes, that old, quiet authority that had led men through stampede and storm, kept him from raising his rifle. The standoff stretched until even the horses felt it, stamping and tossing their heads, the air crackling with the threat of violence. Finally, one of the younger hands, a boy not more than 20, stepped back, face pale. "I'm done," he said, voice cracking. "Ain't what I signed on for." He untied his horse, mounted, and turned toward the trail. That broke the dam. 2 more followed, muttering curses, the sound of spurs clinking like distant thunder as they rode off toward the horizon, their shapes shrinking against the glare until the desert swallowed them whole. Others lingered, uncertain men too proud to leave, too stubborn to speak. Elias stood there, motionless, watching the dust from the departing riders curl upward into the sky. He knew what that dust meant: a reputation undone, a ranch fractured, his authority slipping away like water through cracked hands. He had spent his whole life building this place. Every fence post, every herd, every acre had been a monument to his father's creed, and with one stroke of a knife, he had set fire to it all. But as the silence settled again, and the last of the departing riders vanished into the heat, Elias felt no regret. What filled the hollow inside him wasn't victory or peace, but something quieter, a grim, clear understanding that freedom never came without ruin. Behind him, the girl shifted her weight, eyes fixed on him, waiting for what came next. Elias exhaled, the sound rasping against the stillness. He turned toward the horizon, toward the long road to town, and in the pit of his gut, he knew. He had just traded the respect of men for the redemption of his soul. The moon hung low over the desert, pale and heavy, casting long blue shadows across the land as Elias Cutter tightened the cinch on his dark bay stallion. The ranch behind him lay quiet, broken, a ghost of itself, half his men gone, the rest silent in their bunks, too afraid or too tired to speak of what had happened. The night air was cold enough to bite, the kind that crawled under a man's coat and made his bones remember every year he'd lived. The Apache girl stood a few feet away, her small frame shivering beneath a threadbare blanket one of the ranch hands had left behind. Her wrists were still raw, her eyes wide but dry now, the tears gone, replaced by something steadier, not trust, not yet, but the first fragile edge of belief. Elias reached into the barn for an old canteen, filled it at the trough, and handed it to her without a word. She took it with both hands, her fingers brushing his for just an instant, and that brief, human touch burned hotter than the desert Sunday. Without another look back, he mounted the horse and extended a hand to her. She hesitated, not out of fear, but uncertainty, before grasping his wrist and pulling herself up behind him. The stallion shifted under the weight, snorting, hooves clattering against the packed earth. The stars overhead stretched wide and infinite, sharp as shards of glass scattered across black silk, each one a silent witness to what neither of them could yet say. Elias guided the horse toward the open plain, and soon the ranch was swallowed by distance, its lights flickering out behind them like dying embers. The desert unfolded around them, endless, solemn, the air filled with the soft hiss of wind through sage and the faint creak of saddle leather. For a long while, neither spoke. The girl clung lightly to his coat, her face turned toward the horizon, eyes reflecting the pale glow of starlight. Then, softly, almost imperceptibly, she began to hum. The melody was low, haunting, the kind of tune that rose from the bones rather than the throat. It carried across the still night like smoke from a dying fire, a song of mourning, of love, of something older than grief itself. Elias didn't understand the words, but he didn't need to. The sound filled the emptiness between them, wrapping around his chest and tightening until he could barely breathe. He thought of Mara again, of the nights they'd spent under the same sky, her laughter breaking through the silence of a land that didn't forgive much. Back then, he'd thought the stars were proof of order, that everything, no matter how cruel, had purpose. But now, listening to the girl's song, he realized the stars were simply witnesses, bright, cold eyes watching men destroy and rebuild themselves over and over again. The horse's hooves found a rhythm in the dark, steady as a heartbeat, and Elias let the sound anchor him. "We'll reach town by morning," he said finally, his voice low. "Your brother's still breathing. I'll see to it he stays that way." The girl's song faltered for just a moment, then continued, softer, more uncertain, as though his words had changed its shape. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of rain far off to the west, and the chill deepened. Elias adjusted his coat and felt the girl's head lower against his back. The weight light but grounding. They rode on through the hours, through silence and song, through memory and promise. Two souls stitched together by pain and the faint, flickering thread of redemption. And though Elias could feel the cost of his choice growing heavier with every mile, his name, his land, the life he'd built, he also felt something else stirring beneath the ruin. The slow, quiet heartbeat of peace, the kind a man only finds when he's finally stopped running from himself. By the time the first light of dawn crept over the desert, Elias Cutter and the Apache girl had been riding for hours, the horizon bleeding from black to gold, the chill of the night slowly giving way to the dry breath of morning. The town appeared out of the haze like a mirage, low buildings of warped timber, a few wagons hitched along Main Street, smoke rising from cook fires and chimneys. It was a place Elias knew too well, every nail and dusty board soaked in the same kind of pride that had nearly destroyed him. He slowed his horse as they reached the edge of town, the sound of hooves echoing off the empty street. The girl clung tighter to his coat, her dark eyes darting toward the sheriff's office where a tall figure stood in the doorway, arms crossed. Sheriff Boone was a man carved out of law and stubbornness, the kind who believed in order because it kept men like him from seeing too much of themselves. He'd heard the talk everyone had. Word had ridden faster than dust on the wind that Elias Cutter had gone soft, had cut an Apache loose, had broken the code of his own blood. Boone's face was hard, but there was something else behind his eyes, too, curiosity, maybe pity, or the kind of unease that comes when a man sees another do what he never could. "You picked a hell of a way to start the day, Elias," Boone said as Elias dismounted, his voice carrying just enough mockery to sound like law. "Got half the town riled. Men say you're harboring the enemy." Elias glanced up, his hand steady on the reins. "Ain't harboring anyone. Just bringing what's right." Boone's gaze slid to the girl. "That her?" he asked, nodding. "The one your boys caught rustlin'? You gonna tell me why she ain't swinging from a post right now?" Elias met his stare and didn't blink. "Her brother's in your jail. You took him for murder." Boone's lips twitched into a humorless smile. "That's right. Apache boy stabbed a rancher 2 towns over. Justice is already waitin'." "He didn't do it," Elias said. "You don't know that. And you don't either." The silence that followed was thick, heavy enough to choke on. Townsfolk had begun to gather, drawn by the noise, whispering from porches and saloon doors. Elias could feel their eyes, each one another brand of judgment pressed into his back. "You know what this looks like, Cutter?" Boone said finally. "Looks like you traded sides. Folks are saying you're trying to make peace with people who burned your wife out of her own home. You think mercy makes you a better man?" "No," Elias said quietly. "I think it just keeps me human." Boone's jaw tightened. The crowd murmured. Dust rolled in lazy waves between them. "You want me to let him go?" Boone said after a moment, his voice flat. "You better give me reason." Elias straightened, his shadow stretching long across the dirt. "You want reason? Take my herd. Every last steer on my land. Sell it. Keep it. Do what you will. But let the boy walk free." The words came steady, though they tore something inside him as he said them. Boone stared, his eyes narrowing. "That's your whole damn ranch." "It's worth less than 2 lives, Elias answered. The sheriff studied him for a long, long moment, then nodded once, slow and reluctant. "You're a fool," he said. "But maybe this town needs one." He turned, called for the deputy, and a minute later, the door to the small jail creaked open. The girl gasped when her brother stepped out thin, bruised, but alive, and ran to him, clutching his arms as though afraid he'd vanish. Elias watched, saying nothing, as Boone handed him a piece of paper, the deal signed in dust and sacrifice. The lawman's voice was low when he spoke again. "You just bought yourself an empty pasture, Cutter. Hope you can live with it." Elias nodded once. "I already couldn't," he said, his voice rough, but certain. The sun broke fully then, flooding the street in gold, and for the first time in years, Elias Cutter felt the light without flinching. The sun climbed slowly over the canyon rim, its light spilling across the desert like molten gold, painting the dunes and jagged rocks in hues of fire and forgiveness. Elias Cutter stood in the middle of the dusty street, the brim of his beige hat casting a narrow shadow across his weathered face. his eyes fixed on the two figures riding westward, the Apache girl and her brother, their horses kicking up small plumes of dust that shimmered like smoke in the early light. The girl rode the chestnut mare with her back straight, her long black hair catching the sun in streaks of copper, her turquoise beads glinting like small pieces of sky. Her brother rode beside her on the Palomino Elias had led all through the night, his posture frail but proud. A boy not yet broken by what the world had tried to do to him. Neither looked back. They didn't have to. Elias watched them fade into the horizon, the sound of their horses' hooves blending into the sigh of the morning wind until there was nothing left but silence, that same kind of silence that had lived on his ranch for years. But this time it felt different, lighter somehow. He removed his hat, ran a hand through his sweat-matted hair, and let the wind tug at him, lifting the dust from his coat like it was stripping away the weight he'd carried all his life. The town behind him stirred but didn't speak. People were still watching from their windows, whispering from doorways, trying to decide whether what they'd just seen made Elias Cutter a fool or a saint. He didn't care. For the first time in memory, their judgment didn't matter. The rope was gone, the code broken, the curse undone. The life he'd lived, the ranch, the men, the pride passed down like rusted iron had crumbled beneath a single decision. Yet in that ruin, he'd found something his father had never taught him: peace. He looked down at his hands, scarred and dirt-stained, and thought of the knife that had cut through the rope days before, the same knife that had once been his father's. It felt like a symbol now, not of authority, but of the choice to stop the cycle that had turned men into ghosts long before they died. A strange stillness filled him, neither joy nor sorrow, but something purer release. The wind carried the faint echo of the Apache girl's song, or maybe he only imagined it, the same haunting melody she'd hummed on the night ride, the one that had filled the emptiness between them. It wove through the canyon air, fading but never gone. A reminder that redemption wasn't earned, it was found in the moments a man finally stopped fighting himself. Elias turned slowly, looking back toward the town, then to the land beyond it. His ranch was out there, his fences, his herd, his name, but all that was left of it now belonged to the sheriff, payment for the mercy he'd chosen. He had nothing left but the clothes on his back and the weight in his chest that no longer felt like punishment. He placed his hat back on his head and took a deep breath of the cool morning air, heavy with dust and sunlight. "Pa," he whispered, the word breaking softly against the wind. "I did what you couldn't." The sound barely carried, but it was enough. He turned toward the open desert, the light washing over him until his shape began to blur against the horizon. To anyone watching, he might have looked like a ghost fading into the dawn, but to Elias Cutter, it felt like being born again. Behind him, the sheriff's office and the murmuring town melted into distance. Ahead, the desert stretched wide and endless, waiting. The wind shifted once more, tugging at his coat, and with that final whisper of freedom, Elias Cutter stepped forward into the light, leaving the man he'd been buried in the dust where it belonged.